And now we introduce our second panelist for our second session. Before we bring back our moderator, let me introduce first Police Chief, City of Scottsdale, my friend, Chief Alan Rodbell. Next, we have Chief Special Agent of Attorney General of Arizona, Mr. Reggie Grigsby. We also have Speaker Pro Tempore, Arizona State Representative District 8, Mr. Thomas Ray T.J. Shope, Jr. Arizona State Representative District 28, Mr. Aaron Lieberman. Deputy City Attorney, City of Scottsdale, Mr. Luis Santayela. And the Director of National Litigation for the Goldwater Institute, please welcome Mr. John Riches. Thank you all for being here, panelists. And let's please welcome back to the podium our moderator, back again with us, Dr. Ben Chavis, Jr. Let's give him another round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's give our Master of Ceremonies, Brother Williams, a hand. He's done a great job. Let's give him a hand. So I want to welcome the panel, and we're going to get right into it. I think I would like to start with Luis Santayela. What is the position of Arizona law enforcement agencies on issues like judicial reform, civilian advisory boards, mandatory body cameras, and timely release of body cam video? What single law enforcement policy change could make the positive difference, particularly for communities of color?
First off, I'd like to say that I'm awed and inspired by the voices I've heard today. Obviously, that's a pretty difficult question you're posing for me. In terms of body cameras, people look at them as an easy solution. The problem with body cameras is they're actually quite expensive to keep them going, and it's difficult for smaller agencies to actually pay for body cameras on an ongoing basis because it involves the maintenance of the footage. There's a lot of infrastructure. It's not as simple as just putting a camera on an officer. And I think the solution, larger agencies like Scottsdale Police obviously have the resources and are able to deploy body cameras, and they do. The solution, if it's in the best interest of the community, for all officers, uniformed officers, to deploy body cameras, is for the state to step in and provide resources for those smaller agencies. Certainly, body cameras, they've done studies where it shows that everyone gets more polite when there's a body camera being deployed, the officers, members of the community. So they are a definite helpful tool, and it probably would be a good idea for uniformed officers to use them, but we have to keep in mind that it's a resource issue too, and so hopefully, if that's the direction the community wants to go, that they be deployed through state resources helping out with that. And myself and another panelist here, John Riches, we actually served on a state committee a while ago on body camera usage. So while they're a useful tool, they're not necessarily an end-all if the backdoor resources aren't available.
All right, thank you. I want to turn to the legislation because to me, state provision of resources comes as a consequence of public policy at the state level and legislation passed. So Thomas Ray T.J. Shope, Jr., what kind of legislation has been passed in the last, say, 3 years that helps bridge the law enforcement community and communities of color?
First off, I just want to say thank you to AP for having me here. And I see Mr. Tatum here. We got to know each other little year and a half ago as I'm chairman of the ethics committee as well. We didn't get him on the race charge. We saw the measure of the man later on whenever we discovered what we actually discovered there with Mr. Stringer, and Lord help us if that Yavapai County doesn't elect him county attorney. Body cameras was just brought up, and I am glad that was, because in the House, before COVID, we had to adjourn our session a little early, and I'm hoping that we can go ahead and pick up at some point, because we did, in the House, pass body cameras for all of our state troopers. It was a unanimous vote in the State House. It made it to the Senate, and when COVID began, we actually had to switch gears and move strictly into COVID-related measures before adjourning. I know that that will pass. I have no doubt about it. Before coming, I reached out to my very good friend Joe Kluwer, who's the executive director of the Arizona Association of Police, and I know that that is one issue for them. They would like to see a body camera on every single one of their officers, their members throughout the state, up to and including those that we don't often think about, whether they be basically anybody that comes in front of the public. We have ADOT officers out there. We have game and fish officers out there. In a lot of our rural areas, some of those folks are often the first people that make contact with somebody because there are no local police or county sheriffs nearby. In addition to that, the cost was brought up. That is going to be an issue. In my legislative district, does anybody know where Coolidge, Arizona is? That's where I reside. For an agency like that, they probably could, and they do, and we've received grants for body cams. The expensive part is actually on the storage of those cams and the amount of money that it takes for storage. But I also represent cities like Hayden and Winkleman that have populations of less than 300 each, that oftentimes don't even have an officer on duty in those communities. So to ask them to do something like that, we'll have to come up with some sort of a formula on when the state does step in to help some of these very small, very rural communities achieve that, and not just the one-time purchase of the camera, but also the mega storage that will contain. The other thing that was brought up already, we need to do a better job as far as handing over some of these public records in a more timely manner. Many agencies do a very good job, but we needed to make sure that that is a little more uniform across the state, and hopefully, and I know that that's something that Joe has indicated that their association is interested in working on, as well as some other issues. So I'm looking forward to discussing some of that stuff today.
All right, thank you so much. Let me go to Brother Grisby in State Attorney General's office. It has been said that when you go into most police departments, most law enforcement officers know who the problem officers are or will be. How do you feel about the duty to intervene? Does it go against the blue code or the blue shield to intervene when you know that an officer may be doing something that's problematic or simply not right?
Thank you, Dr. Chavis. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Before I begin, I have to acknowledge members of the clergy that are present. I'm a proud native of Birmingham, Alabama, so we always acknowledge our clergy whenever we're in their presence. So I wanted to get that out of the way. I have a background, I think it's unique. I've had 32 years of law enforcement experience in Southern California. Prior to that, I was in the Army. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama during the Jim Crow days. And one of the things I learned going back to legislation and coming back to your answer, Dr. Chavis, the way that a government feels about its people is manifested in the way the police department treats them. And if you have policymakers that don't care about how people are treated, if you have policymakers that are shirking their responsibilities, then you see what you get. One thing I do want to say, with regards to legislation here, in the presence of our elected officials, we really need to change our legislation and create some legislation. Arizona does not have a statute for assault on the color of authority. You will find that in quite a few different states for police officers. Arizona doesn't have a statute that deals with false returns of search warrants, meaning not a false warrant, but you didn't swear under oath when you return the receipts back to the court. There's not a statute for police officers filing false reports. There's a lot of different things that I think that we could do on the legislative front that could change and empower the ability of the government to hold officers accountable. I also think that we at the Attorney General's office, Mr. Brnovich has advocated for a long time to have the ability to review officer-involved shootings or critical incidents, citizens' complaints, to have that third-party independent review, because that goes to trust and confidence. When I grew up in Alabama, we never trusted a police officer, never. We didn't, as a matter of fact, we didn't trust anybody who was white, because that was our experience growing up. But as we get older and we learn, then we learn that, hey, you know what? At the end of the day, you know, we're all the same. Going back to your question, officers are obligated to report misconduct. There's court rulings that held that officers who are aware of misconduct on the part of an officer, and the policies of the agencies mandate that they have to report that. Generally what happens whenever I was working, if someone had a complaint that was sustained against them and you were present at the time and you were called in as a witness, if we can show that you did not report that from the beginning, then we held you accountable for discipline. There needs to be some legislation, I think, that puts teeth into that. I've seen instances of police agencies have actually shirked their responsibilities. I had an officer that used the N-word. We were looking at whether or not to place that officer on the Brady file, and that local police department, they did not discipline him for using the N-word. They disciplined him for unprofessional conduct. And so we had to make a determination that we're going to disclose to the court before the trial began that that gentleman had used some racist language. So, but there isn't really a code anymore. I'm not really concerned about a code of officers not reporting, because there's video cameras, there's so many people in the public that see so many things. What I'm worried about is the attitudes that I see from officers that are manifested in their social media, that is manifested in their private conversations. Because, you know, when you're a public servant, everything you say is on the record, I feel, off duty or off duty. So I think if we can get some legislation that holds officers to account for that, I think that if we could all agree that there are problems and there has to be some third-party oversight. The way we're going now, we're at a crisis of confidence and public trust. We're at a crisis, and it calls for change now. Not tomorrow, not next week, but now.
Thank you. Of course, what we're trying to determine, Burgess, is how to build more trust, how to build more public confidence in the police, as well as community leaders. I want to go down to the chief. I'll say this on the record. If most cities had a chief of police like the guy y'all got here, Chief Rodbell, we would be in better shape. So Chief Rodbell, let me just ask you, what single law enforcement policy change could make the most positive difference for communities of color? For example, strangleholds. Some know it's chokeholds. Is it de-escalation?
So I don't know if there's any single thing I would point at. I will tell you that I do have some concerns in regard to absolutes, and so I'll talk about that in a second. But before I do that, I wanted to thank AP and the Herozona Foundation for pulling this together. This is, as was mentioned before, this is the 10th Bridge Forum. I've had the pleasure of being involved in 8 of them. One was out of state, and the first one I wasn't invited to. I'm not bitter about that. But I will tell you that it's been worthwhile time spent. And as Mr. Williams mentioned briefly, that there were 26 actual items that came out of one bridge report that we incorporated. I just want to mention to the people maybe viewing from other police departments, many of those 26 items were not necessarily appropriate to the city of Scottsdale, either because of where we are in terms of size or in terms of some of the things we've been involved in. But many of them may be appropriate to the agencies watching. And so we would encourage them to go look at that report, to what those actual items are, and deal with them appropriately. You asked me about what single thing. I think so much of it is important in terms of just relationships. And I think that's one of the things that we have developed here in Scottsdale as a relationship with our community, to listen to the community concerns and to act on that, what we hear. Which is very much evidenced by the fact that we have been involved with the bridge forums for so many years and have taken action on each one of them. When you get into absolutes, my concern is whenever you do absolutes, like you can never do something, and we use the word choke, and choke means so much, you may very well take away the ability for police to resolve things in a nonviolent, safe manner by labeling things. And so I would be very cautious to say just outlaw chokeholds and we'll be fine. I don't really believe that. I believe we have to teach proper techniques. We have to hold officers accountable. They have to use them appropriately, and they have to use them at the right time when they're to be used. And if you don't do that, if you don't train, you don't prepare, you don't practice, you don't understand when it's appropriate and when you've gone too far, then that's when you have problems. And so we talked about this, I think, the last bridge forum, one of the panelists said something about taking tools off the tool belt, but you do have to be concerned to make sure that officers are adequately trained, they're prepared, they understand the rules of engagement, they don't go too far, and other officers' heads are in the game as well, holding them accountable. Holding officers accountable is probably the most important thing that a police chief, a city government, a community can do. Hold the chief accountable, to hold his men and women accountable to do the right thing. And when you have that accountability, people think about the things they're doing while they're doing it. And they understand there's consequences if they don't. So I would say probably the most important thing is making sure that, one, the laws and rules are there for us, the regulations are there, the policies are in place. We have the ability to be an accredited police department, like universities and hospitals are accredited. We've been accredited since the 90s. We get reaccredited every year. Those are things we can do to ensure accountability in law enforcement. That's the most important thing. And hold the police chief to be accountable as well.
Very good, thank you. To Aaron Lieberman, some believe law enforcement unions and advocacy groups have been highlighted as being part of the problem. What legislation can be worked on that can work for police and citizens? Is it comprehensive reporting changes? Is it exhausting all alternatives before shooting? What are your thoughts?
Thank you very much. I want to say thank you to AP for inviting me on this panel, and I'm having a little fanboy moment here. I'm texting my friends that you are the moderator of this panel, which I can't believe. I really appreciate.
Thank you.
I just want to say everyone's been super polite here, and no one has mentioned, about 2 miles from here, Deon Johnson was killed by a DPS officer the same day that George Floyd was shot. We have no idea what happened in that car today because he wasn't wearing a body camera. And I think if you just use your mind for a minute and picture that Deon Johnson, who was asleep in his car at the Gore point, the intersection point of the highway, if you just picture in your head that he was in a pickup truck and maybe had boots on like my friend TJ, and the officer, which happened, found a pistol in his car, which he removed while he was asleep, I don't think anybody thinks the person in that car would be dead today. That's just the reality of the situation. And so we have a very big problem. We have a very big problem right here in Arizona. This isn't some distant thing. Mr. Tatum mentioned in his comments that the numbers that we saw from the Phoenix police previously. But, this is also a personal issue for anyone who cares about equality and for anyone who cares about, honestly, black boys and black men in this country. And for me, some of you may know in this room, it's quite personal. I'm raising 2 black boys who we adopted when they were infants. And just like any parent of a black child, I've had the conversation with them about how you're going to be seen when you're out in the rest of the community and how you need to act if law enforcement are involved. My greatest hope is that they won't have to have that conversation with my grandchildren. That would be a dream if we actually got serious about what we're doing. I'll tell you again, I think there has not been nearly enough action. I think he was at the previous Bridge Forum. My colleague Reginald Boulding, our longest-serving African-American member in the State House, running now for his 4th term, he, after each of these shootings, has introduced bills that are common-sense bills, in many instances supported by the Arizona Association of Police themselves, who I'm happy to have their endorsement. I've talked to Joe Clare. They're supportive of these things, and we can't get any action. I mean, the bills that Reginald Boulding has introduced that never even got a hearing, sensitivity training for police. Who's on the other side of that you can't even give a hearing to that bill? Having a database if a police officer has been disciplined for excessive use of force in one area that only other police departments can check, before they hire that officer to know if he's been involved in excessive use of force. Again, these are things supported by the police, and Representative Bolding has long been advocating for body cameras. I'll tell you that to Representative Shope's point, the governor had $5 million for body cameras in his budget for GPS. It passed the House 60-0. I've called publicly. I hope our clergy here will join me. I hope everyone will get involved and say, let's have a special session right now and do the 3 or 4 things that we have broad agreement on to show that we're actually making progress. From body cameras to that database. I mean, things that have broad agreement. We'd love to hear your ideas and the Attorney General's ideas, but we're never going to have more momentum than we have right now. And I've just seen this personally in my own network of friends. Everyone who has Facebook knows, you kind of see how different events impact different friend groups, right, in real live time. Every other police shooting before George Floyd, I saw some white allyship saying, yeah, this is sad, before it was kind of on to the next thing. And I saw my African-American friends decimated for weeks at a time, and if not months, just because of what they are living with every single day. George Floyd somehow, and I don't know why, I mean, for those of us who've been watching, it's Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice was 11 years old when he was shot and killed within 5 seconds of a police car pulling up to that park in Cleveland, right? All on video. We've seen all of this, right? Ahmaud Arbery going for a jog, right? I mean, but something about George Floyd seemed to connect both that white audience and that African-American audience that has always been outraged for hundreds of years. The only difference is now it's on videotape that everybody can see. I mean, that is the difference that's right now. We need to take advantage of this moment. And by the way, you see it in poll numbers. High levels of support among Republicans for the Black Lives Matter movement. We've never seen that before. I'm not sure if the governor has still said if Black Lives Matter out loud. I'd love to hear our Republican colleagues say that sentence out loud. Black Lives Matter. It's really important right now for everyone to hear that this is not a partisan thing, and it should not be a partisan thing. I don't know. I know plenty of Republicans, as my friend TJ can attest, I don't know a single one that thinks black people should be killed disproportionately to white people. But what we need is people to stand up and say, this is about keeping everybody safe in Arizona right now, and there are things we could do in 4 hours in a special session to move the state forward. We should absolutely stop talking and start doing.
Thank you. That's a good segue. I want to go to John Richards. Good to see you again. You have experience, a lot of experience, on working on passing legislation. And so far, the panel has touched on the importance of getting something done now in this moment that we're all experiencing together. You served as a clerk on the Judiciary Committee. Give us your thoughts regarding these cries about defund the police. We've heard that it's important to fund body cameras, but then there's another outcry saying defund the police. So tell us from your perspective, what is really possible for the legislature to get done?
Thank you, Dr. Chavis. Thank you for everything you've done for the country and for your personal generosity of your time for our organization. You featured speaker last year for us. Thank you to AP as well. Appreciate very much the partnership we have with Herozona. To answer your question, because it's come up a lot, there's structural problems, some structural problems in place that have prevented a lot of positive legislative change. And candidly, one of those structural problems can be police unions. And that's the case for a few reasons. I want to note two, and then I want to give you a few practical examples of how some reforms have been prevented as a result of some of these organizations. The first is when you're a public servant, you should have fiduciary obligations. You should have your duties run to the citizen. I know this is a Herozona-sponsored event, and there's many military members in the audience and on this panel. And when we were in the military, our fiduciary obligations, our pledge was to the Constitution and to the citizens. It wasn't to some private organization. Now, those who run private organizations can and should have fiduciary obligations to that organization, but I think there's a conflict, an inherent conflict that occurs when that obligation confronts their duties to the public. And second, police unions, public safety unions have the ability, as one prominent labor leader put it, to elect their own bosses. They are very politically engaged, and so they can elect sympathetic lawmakers that then put in place structural protections that don't apply to any other workers, including other public workers. So I want to speak practically as to what we've seen as a result of this. In 1980, there was 12 statewide prisons in the state of California. About that time, the California Correctional Police Officers Association became active, and from 1980 to 2000, 22 new prisons were constructed in the state. And then, as a large part as a result of their advocacy. And then, of course, this advocacy snowballs, and this organization was one of the biggest proponents for the three strikes law, which has in many ways decimated many black communities and other communities. Luis mentioned the body cam committee that we both sat on. The governor appointed 5 or 6 years ago an ad hoc committee on body cameras long before George Floyd and some others. And it was a huge cross-section of the community. There's 15 or 16 members of the community. We heard testimony for 3 days from members of law enforcement, from members of the community. Body cameras are good. They protect the citizen from issues of use of force issues from the police. They protect the police from allegations of misconduct. So that was the whole testimony. The day before, the committee was supposed to make a recommendation as to what ought to be done, and the recommendation was passing statewide legislation that would require body cameras. Many police unions came out, said, nope, we don't want any mandate from the state. Every single person on that committee, a huge cross-section of the community, voted against it, except for John Kavanaugh and myself. And finally, one thing that could certainly be done is this problem called release time. This is where government agencies, public agencies, pay government workers not to do the jobs they were hired to do, including the incredibly important job of law enforcement. They pay them instead to work full-time for a police union while receiving their public salaries. And what happens as a result of that is you have taxpayers funding a collective bargaining process that put in place protections that no other employee enjoys, including disciplinary protections. Derek Chauvin, the police officer who murdered George Floyd, had 17 allegations of misconduct against him. But as a result of disciplinary processes that were put in place from collective bargaining agreements, because of free representation that was provided in many cases through release time, police officers that ought to be disciplined and removed from the force are often kept on. So those are just a few of the items I would highlight. I'm happy to discuss many more.
Thank you. Chief Warbell, next steps. As a police chief here in Scottsdale, what's your view of what can practically be done now to move this opportunity forward to improve police and community relations?
Thank you, Dr. Chavis. We, as a result of the last strategic plan that we mentioned, there were some actual items. We pulled 7 of those out and brought them into our strategic plan, and many of those dealt with employer-community relationships, developing those relationships, a lot more youth engagement groups, and we've done some things as a result of that in the past. Those things were, we looked at restorative justice as a program in the city of Scottsdale, which meant first-time youth offenders didn't go right into a court system. They were actually pulled out of the court system and given an opportunity to make restitution, do some community service work, get counseling, whatever was deemed necessary to keep them out of future contact with law enforcement and the courts. We also created community engagement groups at every district. We had 4 district stations. Each district commander called from their communities, their neighborhoods, their religious organizations, their businesses, a group that came together to discuss topics that were occurring not just within their communities, but also within the city. I took a group out of each of those groups into my community engagement group meeting, and then included people that had a larger picture view of the valley. There's 3 members in this very room that are on my community engagement group, and we talk about issues, talk about use of force, we talk about police policies, we talk about complaints now, complaints are handled, and a lot of the concerns have already been discussed today. That came out of the last report. What occurred 2 weeks ago, we actually took a look at some of the things that were discussed 2 weeks ago and have made some decisions on things that we're going to, at this point, test to see how well they work. There's been a huge outcry of taking responsibilities away from police departments that aren't necessarily police responsibilities, but have fallen on the police because the police are government 24/7. You call for help in the middle of the night, you get the police. You don't get the people filling in the holes on the roadway. And so we looked at that and we said, well, maybe there's some things we can do and offload. So we're going to do an experiment. We've got the resources to be able to at least do a demonstration project where we're going to take an officer that has a great deal of experience with crisis intervention. We have all of our officers have been given a little mental health first aid so they can de-escalate situations when they respond to them. But a few of our officers have a great deal of training in crisis intervention. And so we're going to take a couple of our officers that have that ability, and we're going to team them up with another group of people that Scottsdale has that's very unique. We have a police crisis intervention specialist team that are master's level counselors. They work for the police department. This was an innovative idea Scottsdale put together back in the 1970s. When no one was thinking about this. They brought these counselors together, made them part of the police department, and at this point, they're doing follow-up. They do runaways, they respond if officers request response. We're going to make them first responders, and we're going to see if we can offload police calls from traditional police response to this team of an officer that has a great deal of training along with a crisis counselor, and we're going to see if we can offload some work from patrol and get away from those calls that people are concerned most that officers arrive at and may not have the skill sets. I'm also going to put another line of level of supervision in one of my stations just to test this out, to have them review use of force reports as they come across on a daily basis and arrests. And to make sure that those reports, the video that's been produced, because all our officers have video cameras, and the reports all match up and make sense, and it's justifiable. Not as a checks and balances as much as just one more further review to make sure things are being done well. The street sergeants themselves just don't have enough time to do all of that and everything else they're required to do to supervise men and women on the street. So we're going to do that. The next thing I'm going to do is we're going to increase the number of civilians we have on non-police folks that we have on our use of force review boards and our major incident review boards, and those are the officer-involved shooting cases. We already have civilians on there. We're going to increase the number of civilians on there for review. Now, those are 3 things that just sort of came out with what's going on nationally, but also as a result of the last bridge
Chief,
forum.
how are the civilians selected? What is the criteria for a citizen to be on the review board?
We actually prefer that our citizens that we appoint actually go through our Citizens Academy so they understand the workings of the police department, the sections of the police department, so they understand the policies, so they have some exposure to us. But unfortunately, in a COVID world, we're not having a Citizens Academy at this point. So we're going to have to look at our community engagement groups to see who have already demonstrated active interest, and we might put out a statement of interest to the public. But we are looking to make sure that there are folks that come from all of our communities, represent all of our communities.
Great. So, Officer Grisby, I'm going to go back. One of the things we see around the country is the lack of data per state. From the state attorney general's out, are you collecting any data on issues revolving police and community relations?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Chavis. No, we do not collect information regarding citizen complaints or other community outreach programs that are provided by agencies in the state. I will say that we are in the process of managing the Brady List. The Brady List, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it is a case going back several years ago, back to 1963, that deals specifically with police and prosecutors having the duty to disclose any issue to the court that could affect the truthfulness of a witness or an officer, or could speak to less culpability on the part of the accused. One thing I wanted to say, though, with regards to next steps, We go to the range, our agents go to the range 4 times a year. They're not on the front lines. They go to the range 4 times a year. There are some police agencies that only go 1 time a year. What does that mean? That means that when you have a lot more experience handling your weapons and you have a lot more confidence in your abilities, you're not so quick to shoot yourself into a bad situation because you realize that under whatever the circumstances are that you encounter, you're a little bit better trained, a little bit better equipped to deal with that. We deal with force escalation, we train in cultural diversity, we train in mental health issues. Concomitant with this issue of legislation, there has to be some changes with regards to what's mandated for training. You know, Chief Rod Bell and I have had discussions about this. He serves on post. He's a gentleman I've known for a long time, and he's a very big advocate of this. But we don't have any mandates for any of this training after the academy. So there's no mandates for de-escalation. There's no mandates for cultural diversity. It is in the academy, but there's none at the end, and it's up to each department. I think we need to standardize that training, and we need to continue to move along those lines. And the last thing I wanted to say is this, and I speak back to our legislators and to attorneys. You know, one of the things we learned in Alabama was that, yeah, we could all march in the streets and we could demonstrate and we could boycott and we can do things. But as my father told us, and a very wise old man, he says, until an attorney goes into the courtroom and convinces the court what equity and what fairness is, it ain't over until the attorney says it's over. And so I hope that as we talk about this reform and this reformation and changes, that we include our legal partners in that. Because they, at the end of the day, they're going to be the ones that have to go into court anyways to make the case. So I think they have a very critical role to say in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll go back to Aaron. Broadly speaking, what do you see on the horizon? I think we all agree that we live in a special moment now. Do you believe things will subside and we go back to the old abnormal, or will there be a new normal or a new abnormal?
I hope we'll have something different than what we've had. That's the reality of it. I think that's what we really, really need. I will say I agree a lot with what Victor said. There's just one point. The police union does not elect legislators. The people elect legislators, right? We're responsible to the members of our legislative district, and we have a duty to be responsive to those folks. And there's an election coming up. And I think, you know, I think many people think for the first time in about 5 decades, there's going to be a change of control in the state house, maybe in the state senate. And I think you will see on day one a whole set of different issues addressed and talked about publicly. We've had going on 10 years of one-party rule. I don't like to get super partisan and stuff, but this gets down to politics. We haven't had a whole set of ideas presented or even heard. I mean, literally not even given a hearing in the cold gray light of dawn. We will at least start to have a real dialogue starting November 3rd if we're successful. If we're not, I hope that there will just be a greater openness and a willingness to say that, and I feel this very strongly, we should first think as Arizonans, and second think about whatever party we represent or any other consideration. And it's very clear. I grew up in the state, born and raised. To your point, Dr. Chavis, what is so special about Arizona? We built this state out of a dry desert wash bed against very long odds. The thing I loved about growing up here was it didn't matter who your family was, didn't matter who you knew. Everyone came here pretty much, many folks from somewhere else, and everybody was treated the same way and had that same opportunity. It was actually very inclusive and a very welcoming state. And we have lost our way, and we need to get it back to those roots that is truly the Arizona way. And part of that is not just saying, you know, I'm not racist. It's saying I'm anti-racist. I want to do the things that stop racism, and that involves having a proactive agenda down at the Capitol, and it involves citizens demanding it. And we've seen this again and again and again. When people get involved, lots and lots of people expressing what they want, change happens, and that's what we need right now is some change.
Thank you. Thomas Ray, I'm going to go back to you. Legislatively, I think you've given the background on where things are at the state capitol. But what do you see? Is there any breakthrough legislation? Is there any one bill that you think could rise to the occasion to make Arizona the leading state in the nation on racial justice?
Thanks, you bet. And I'm all for change. I'm not for the change that Aaron wants as far as partisan change down there, obviously. I enjoy my position, but, But no, in all seriousness, I think that, first off, this is low-hanging fruit. We already talked about body cameras, passed 60-0. It would have got a vote in the Senate. It would have passed 30-0 in the Senate. It would have been signed by the governor had this not happened. That is a definite. I think, but I also believe another definite is an expansion of what that original legislation was. We were talking about state troopers at that time. I think you're going to see a true expansion of what that entails. The devil is in the details on what that means as far as, like I mentioned earlier, smaller communities like I represent that truly would have difficulty affording some of these things. And that's where we're going to have to step in and figure out what that budget looks like for some of those communities. There's other things that are out there. Many agencies across our state have what are called ombudsmans, okay? These individuals and these offices help average ordinary citizens file complaints correctly, okay? Many times things are either cast aside or overturned because they're not filed correctly. I can tell you as the Ethics Committee Chair how many times I've received things and oh, well, you know what, it's not properly done, so I can't do anything because the rules that I have don't allow me to, right? So we should have an ombudsman position created that would oversee the law enforcement community and assist average ordinary citizens with these complaints. I know that I would probably, and Chief Rodbell, what you're talking about as far as what was implemented in the city of Scottsdale in the 70s, if you ask the average everyday street officer if they like going and doing, or if they feel like they are prepared and trained to do mental health calls, they would say, hell no. I don't believe that I am the right person most of the time to do this stuff. I have family that are police officers. My grandfather was an agent and a precursor to the DEA, and that's why they ended up in Arizona, because he was a Hispanic man who spoke Spanish and ended up here and worked every border town that there was. So I talk to cops, I know cops very well. It's something very personal to me. But I also have that double lens as well, because I am also half Hispanic, and I see what goes on in communities, especially in communities of color in this state. And if you know anything about Coolidge, you know darn well that it is a major community of color in the state of Arizona. And I think that there are things that we can do, and mental health was one of those things. What they're talking about, I'd like to see that program expanded statewide. If it has to be done on a pilot basis, where we are using these teams of professionals to go out with, obviously, maybe you do have to have one officer there just in case things truly do get out of hand. But let's try to go with a softer hand in some of these things instead of enraging the situation even more. Homeless calls are another one. I think we have some agreement that there would be a lot of us who are very interested in getting the police out of homeless calls, of people being in front of a business or people being at a bus stop for too long or whatever the case may be, or as Mr. Chukri's example, if it wasn't you sitting at that table, somebody would have gone and asked the manager to call the police to get that individual out of that coffee shop that day. So we have to think about what we're going to do in situations like that. Are there folks that we can go into the civilian community with who are trained that could accompany an officer who may be one to stand back and allow that professional to work with that individual to get them the help into the place that they need. Yes, de-escalation training that is not just done once at the academy, but done on and on and on. I can tell you, I work in finance for a local banking institution here that does mainly small business and a lot of business loan opportunities. And we do training on so often that my fiance thinks all I do is log in to do these training workshops to make sure that we are doing the things that we're supposed to be doing. We should be doing the same thing for others in other professions, especially that we hold in such high regard, as I hold this profession in high regard. And we also have to talk about, I think that AG's office is, you brought up some good points about being the third-party agency to do things. I have had some conversations with others, and I think that that's a great starting point. That should be a part of the conversation. I tend to believe that we should have an entirely separate agency of law enforcement that is not somebody that is, we send something from Scottsdale over to Phoenix, or we send something from Coolidge over to the town of Florence. Perhaps it needs to be something that's entirely independent, that where these folks are completely trained in this type of activity, and that is something that we need to probably take a look at going forward. So I think that there are many, many things on the horizon that can be changed going forward, and I look forward to doing that. And I will echo one thing that Aaron said, and I love Justin. We work out together. Actually, we haven't done that yet, but because the gyms are closed. But I think in other states, yes, especially ones that have where unions are a very big deal. Arizona's not one, obviously, but in other states, absolutely. What that officer being 17 times, that's just mind-blowing and maddening at the same time. In Arizona, it's I find, especially working with Mr. Kluwer, there is a lot of agreement on what should be done, what needs to be done. I can't tell you how happy I am. I live in Pinal County. If you look at the demographic population of the county, the sheriff's office pretty darn closely resembles the demographic population of Pinal County. And it's been an effort that has been in place, not with the current, not with the last, not with the previous, but over multiple sheriffs over multiple years that have been elected in that county. And it's something that is a tradition that has continued there, and I'm very proud of that. So we have to look around and look at the things that work and try to emulate that as much as possible across the state, knowing that not every community is the same, but we can do things that work in other places.
Thank you. Louis, I'm going to go back. You're the city attorney. One of the things that we see in Arizona and other states is a disproportionate incarceration, disproportionate impact. And a lot of that takes place because of the juries, the jury trials. There's also not enough representation of minorities in the jury pools. What is the city of Scottsdale, what are the standards for jury selection?
So in terms of how we get jurors, we actually contract out with the Maricopa County Superior Court. So they send us our jurors. But our jurors here in Scottsdale have to foremost be citizens that reside within the city itself, right?
Do you have to be a property owner to be considered? Do you have to be a property?
You actually have to live here and be registered to vote in the city of Scottsdale.
So just voter registration is enough, not?
Correct. So if you're a renter, but you live here and you're registered to vote, you'd be eligible. So obviously, your jurors are going to reflect the demographics of the jurisdiction. Some of the things that we've been doing at the city of Scottsdale in terms of restorative justice, we started a veterans court to deal with some of the unique issues that veterans have. We've also started a community intervention court that is primarily designed to help people with homeless issues, where we provide them social services, hopefully to break the cycle of being in the criminal justice system and homelessness. We also have expanded the types of crimes that we offer diversion for, to hopefully give those people that don't have a criminal history a chance to work off that initial charge. We've expanded, for example, we didn't used to offer diversion for people that had drug paraphernalia that happened to have meth or some other drug in it. We do things like that. We are trying to initiate a lot of different things to keep people out of the system, to break the cycle, so to speak. But back to your original question, the jury issue really is a reflection of your demographics, of your community, because of who lives in your community and who chooses to answer the juror summons to.
Right. I probably had a little bias in asking you that question. The Wilmington Team, which I was a part of in the 1970s, of course, I'm sure Arizona's not like North Carolina was, but we knew the 10 of us, we were accused unjustly of assaulting police and rioting. And we knew, because before the trial, we need to get some black people on the jury selection in the voir dire. To make a long story short, we had 2 trials. The first trial, we had 10 blacks and 2 whites. We were ready to go to trial. After the jury is sworn in, the prosecutor approached the judge and said, Your Honor, the state is not prepared to go forward with this trial. And the judge said, well, you know, we just been 2 weeks selecting the jury. They've been sworn in. Why does the state not want to go forward? So the prosecutor says, well, Your Honor, I have this is the prosecutor, I'm quoting the prosecutor, says, Your Honor, I have a stomach ailment. And there's no one else that can carry this trial. This is an important trial to the state of North Carolina. We just can't proceed. Now, he didn't say on the record that the reason why he didn't want to go for the trial because you had 10 blacks and 2 whites on the jury, but it was obvious. So the judge picks up the gavel, did mistrial. And because it was a mistrial, we had to obviously have a second trial. This time, they sent in a special assistance from the State Attorney General's office in Raleigh. And they changed the jury selection process. There's something called preemptory challenges for the lawyers who are here. And the preemptory challenges are all based on race. That means you can take somebody out of the jury pool without even asking them their background or question. You're dismissed. Because there were 10 defendants, the state had 4 preemptory challenges per defendant. So they used all 40 preemptory challenges to exclude blacks from the jury. So we wind up with a jury of 10 whites and 2 blacks. And the 2 blacks on the jury were elderly who fell asleep constantly through the trial. That was the jury that convicted us. 10 of us were sentenced to 282 years in prison in 1972. Obviously, we filed an appeal. We won the appeal. Took almost a decade to win the appeal, get the convictions overturned. Then it took another 30 years for the state to issue a pardon of innocence, a 40-year struggle. Writing a book about it right now. But the point is, if we'd had a fair jury, if the jury did represent the community in which this happened, history would have been changed in that situation. And a lot of this, I've talked to the state attorney general now in Minnesota, who's prosecuting the officers for George Floyd. His name is Keith Ellison. They're also having a struggle now about jury, the eventual trial of those police officers. They're going to have to find a jury that can also give the police officers a fair trial. So jury selection is something that I think that doesn't get talked about a lot in police and community relations. But I want to say it's very, very important that when citizens, just like voting, it shouldn't be voter suppression. But it also, there should not be jury selection suppression. There shouldn't be suppression that literally prevents persons of color to get into the system. I tell correctional officers all the time, I'm glad that there are people of color who are also correctional officers because they, I think, will treat the disproportionately minorities who are incarcerated differently. That's been my experience, personally, seeing. And about veterans, I think it's a shame that if you do a national study, that disproportionately, almost 60% of all persons of color who served in the Vietnam War, you know where they are today? They're incarcerated. You know, who had adjustment problems coming back after the Vietnam War. And this is not even going to Desert Storm and others. So I just think this whole veterans thing is also something that needs to be really highlighted. But I just want to let you know, Luis, I think that Scottsdale as well as Phoenix would help to change the change that we're all calling for if we looked at every point of the system. Because when you say that you use the term systemic racism, that means the whole system. It's not just one aspect of the system. There's a lot of attention now on the patrol officer, the policeman on the beat, but it's what happens inside the police force, Chief, as you had mentioned, about how to hold the whole system accountable. Sometimes the system itself is the problem, as well as the people who work for the system. And a lot of times, the legislative changes that we call for, they kind of tinker with the system, but they don't ultimately change the system. And to me, that is one of the challenges. I think we just have a few minutes left. We got 1 minute left. Let's thank the panel. And I think, Brother Winston's come, I think we want to do some videotapes of each member of the panel afterwards. Is that right? But listen, I thoroughly enjoyed this. I hope that brothers and sisters listening on social media got a lot of insight. I think that, Reverend Stewart, I think it's fair to say that Arizona is on a threshold. We probably have been here before, but I think there's some indicators that we can go across that threshold to a new reality, to a better Arizona, to a better Scottsdale, to a better Phoenix, to a better county, to a better nation. And we change America, we change the world. God bless you. Thank you for coming.